Okay, so the title of my talk today is Brains Under Attack, the Epidemic of Inflammatory Neurobehavioral Disorders in Children, what's causing them and how to reverse them. So I know that seems like quite a mouthful for a title of a talk, and I'll get into some details about what I think is a very under-recognized epidemic that's happening in our kids, and something that we can actually do a whole lot about if we just understand a little bit more about what's happening. Before we get into that specifically, just a little bit of background. As was mentioned, these are a couple of books that I've authored around children's health and what I call the new childhood epidemics, which are these conditions that didn't exist, a few decades ago in great numbers: autism, ADHD, asthma, allergies, type 2 diabetes, all these kinds of things that were very rare in children, but now seem to be the norm. So we now have 1 in 2 American children with a diagnosed chronic health condition. And many of these conditions have a neuroinflammatory component, and that's going to be the focus of my talk today. So the neuroinflammatory term is almost a little bit jarring or concerning. What does that mean to have a neuroinflammatory condition? It really just means what that word sounds like: brain inflammation, neuroinflammation, inflammation that affects the central nervous system or the brain. So what's interesting is that there are very many conditions that have a neuroinflammatory conditions that most people don't even know that there's a neuroinflammatory condition. So conditions like depression, anxiety, mood disorders, ADHD, even eating disorders, and tics, Tourette syndrome, PANS and PANDAS, which I'm really going to go into deep today, autism spectrum disorders. These conditions, even though they seem like they are mental health conditions or psychiatric conditions, that's sort of how we understand them, there is a neuroinflammatory component to these conditions. And in older populations, these conditions look like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or MS. So these are across the spectrum, across the age spectrum, but I'm going to focus specifically about children's conditions today. So again, these are conditions that were once believed to be psychiatric or mental health or mood disorders or behavioral, because a lot of times in children in particular, these conditions present as odd or irregular behavior, concerning behaviors. And so sometimes that ends up having psychologists deal with these or psychiatrists deal with these. But what I want to talk about is the underlying medical conditions in these disorders. So we have to start thinking about these conditions as whole body conditions. So in the past, these would again mostly be handled in sort of the mental health sphere. But now, increasingly, they're being looked at by practitioners who practice functional medicine, integrative medicine, holistic, whole body kinds of approaches. And we're now understanding that they are very much mediated by the immune system. They are really closely tied to the gut and the health of the gut. So something that's been well established in the last few years or decade plus is this connection between the gut and the brain. It's known as the gut-brain axis. The immune system is housed in the gut. So we really need to look at the whole body, what's happening in the gut, before we can understand what's happening in the brain in these neuroinflammatory and neurobehavioral conditions. The ones in children in particular, again, I think there's a real risk of these children not getting proper treatment when they're seen primarily as behavioral. So ADHD, I can't focus, I can't pay attention in class, or, I'm fidgety, or I can't sit still. That seems behavioral. And so oftentimes we end up managing these things, again, through things like cognitive behavioral therapy, or psychiatrists or psychologists are helping provide supports, which can be helpful, but it isn't getting to the root causes. So that's the risk we run. And especially because it's children, it's so much about children's behavior and what they do and the symptoms they express. Can be reflected in this idea that parenting is involved, which of course parenting is involved, but I'm just trying to point out that it's not the whole picture. There's way more going on with these kids who have significant behavioral problems or significant behavioral issues, especially when they have one of these types of diagnoses. So I'm going to dive into a condition called PANS. So PANDAS is relatively new. You may not be familiar with it. It really started coming to our awareness in the late 1990s. PANDAS stands for Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome, which is also a mouthful. And there is an associated condition that's called PANDAS, which is a little bit more specific. This is pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcus bacteria. So these are, PANDAS is kind of an umbrella term, and PANDAS is a specific type of PANDAS. I'll explain a little bit more about the symptoms, but this is a class of conditions that are autoimmune in nature. So if you look at the chart on the right, what's happening in these conditions is that these children are experiencing autoimmune encephalopathy. And that means that the immune system is attacking the brain and causing inflammation in the brain. Again, neuroinflammation. Or it could be in the central nervous system in general. So because what happens is the immune system is attacking tissue in the brain where certain functions happen and certain processes are going on, it's disrupting behavior, mood, all these kinds of things that, again, you thought were sort of just in this, separate from the body. These are things that are occurring because the brain is under attack by the immune system. So this includes conditions like OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. It includes conditions like anxiety, eating disorders, tics, Tourette syndrome. They're all in this field of autoimmune encephalopathy. So PANDAS and PANDAS are really interesting, almost like a prism that you can look through and see a whole window into what's happening to our children in general, in terms of their being impacted with this whole new cluster of diagnoses that didn't used to exist just a few decades ago in any great numbers. So I like to look at PANDAS and PANDAS as a window into what's happening to our kids, because it's oftentimes sudden, meaning that you have children who are developing normally along a traditional developmental trajectory, and then they suddenly develop these new symptoms, these new psychiatric symptoms. So something happened, right? Something triggered. So it isn't conceived of as genetic or that they've always had this. There's something environmental going on. And I think that's really important for us to understand, because all of these conditions, whether they're ADHD or autism or OCD or anxiety, they all have maybe a genetic component, but the environmental piece is massively important. And when you look at a condition like PANDAS and PANDAS that has a sudden onset, that tells us something in the environment changed or something in their body changed. So let's take a deep dive and look into that so we can understand all of these conditions. So I'm going to do a deep dive on PANDAS and PANDAS, again, because it gives us so much insight into all of these conditions. So what are the symptoms of PANDAS? Another term is autoimmune encephalitis. So PANDAS, PANDAS, and autoimmune encephalitis. Anxiety is a hallmark of these conditions. Children who are normally kind of calm, cool, collected kids suddenly feeling like they can't separate from mom, or they're terrified if dad goes away on a trip. Mood swings, red rage, like screaming, tantruming, kind of intense behavioral reactions to things that typically, again, is new. Emotional lability, depression. A lot of that times these children will develop suicidal ideation out of nowhere. All of a sudden they hate themselves and they want to kill themselves. And, again, these are normally developing kids who never had these kinds of things, and all of a sudden are having these really strange and odd behaviors. Irritability, aggression, sensory abnormalities are a massive part of this. You will see children who normally ate, typically lots of different types of foods, all of a sudden develop severe food aversions, and they can't stand the sound of somebody chewing food, or they can't stand the feeling of food in their mouths, and oftentimes develop anorexia and will lose significant amounts of weight. So another common feature is that you'll see children with behavioral regressions. So they may, for instance, begin bedwetting, or they may begin baby talking. And imagine a parent who has, a child that's 8, 9, 10, who's just been a typical kid, and all of a sudden they start baby talking and bedwetting, and they lose their ability to write. This is a very concerning condition for parents, and it's terrifying for them. Another feature is tics. So you saw a moment ago that I had that overlap where you saw tics and Tourette syndrome. So physical tics like hair pulling, shoulder shrugging, blinking, coughing, or throat clearing. You might see a lot of that, and it gets repetitive and constant. There's also sleep disturbances, insomnia happens, obsessive compulsive behaviors develop, and sometimes when it's really severe, you'll even have auditory or visual hallucinations. So the thing that's most concerning to me is, I've been looking at this condition for about 10 years, and I have met many parents who had this experience where their child basically became what they would describe as suddenly crazy or psychotic. And these are words that are commonly used by parents. Another thing is, this is not my child. I don't know what happened to my child. And many times these children are admitted into psychiatric wards in hospitals because nobody knows what to do with this child. They're having a psychotic break. They're in psychosis. And it's absolutely life-changing for these families. Some of the milder cases that might be seen as, like a little obsessive compulsive type behavior, or a little tic, or, a little red rage crops up then and there. And that kind of thing is, it slides by, it doesn't necessarily get a diagnosis, but it's kind of almost like the milder version of PANS and PANDAS, where they might manage it with cognitive behavioral therapy or some of the other tools that psychologists and psychiatrists use. And so they're not going to get the treatment that maybe they ought to. But what you're looking at here on the slide is a documentary film that looks into PANS and PANDAS. This is a film called My Kid Is Not Crazy. And I think that's such a appropriate title, because that's exactly what these parents go through, is this experience of like, their child was fine, and then all of a sudden they started acting crazy, and the parents are desperate to say, this is not my child. My child is not crazy. But people don't necessarily know their child. And so all they see is a psychosis, and then they treat them as really a mental health abnormality or a mental health anomaly. And we need to look deeper into what's causing these behaviors in children so that they can get the help that they need. So how common are these conditions in our children? There's no doubt that all of these conditions I've mentioned, all these neuroinflammatory, neurobehavioral, and neurodevelopmental conditions are on the rise. Autism would be, of course, the one that people talk the most about. Autism was about 1 in 10,000 in the 1970s, and now we're at 1 in 44. Some epidemiological studies even put it at 1 in 30 kids in the United States. So this is something that has a lot of debate around it. There is no question that this is better diagnosed. We know that we are doing a much better job finding kids and diagnosing them early, especially, but it doesn't explain the absolute skyrocketing rate of this condition, and it's continuing to grow every year. PANS and PANDAS, nobody actually really knows how many kids are impacted with PANS and PANDAS, and that's partly because people are not diagnosing it still. Meaning, as I just described, when these kids have these psychotic episodes, or they develop these kinds of OCDs, problems, or tics, a lot of the pediatricians never learned about this in medical school. And so they don't diagnose this, and we're not doing a good job tracking these kids. So Sue Swato and the NIH, Sue Swato, who was at the NIH, did a really good job bringing awareness to this condition to the medical community, but it still really hasn't permeated into most practices. So the estimates are about 1 in 200 children, but I think that's a very low estimate, and it affects many more children than that. And the other thing that's hard to do with epidemiology is the overlapping diagnoses. So, a child might get an anorexia diagnosis or an OCD diagnosis, but not a PANDAS diagnosis. So because there's that overlap, it's hard to know exactly how many kids have PANS or PANDAS. It's estimated about 1 in 162 children are diagnosed with Tourette syndrome, which is actually, that's pretty well known and pretty well established. So that seems to be a more accurate number. And then, there's many more conditions. There's depression, there's anxiety, ADHD, which again, is one of those things that always surprises people, to think of ADHD as a neuroinflammatory condition or neurobehavioral inflammatory condition, but there's absolutely inflammation going on with that condition as well. And it's extremely prevalent in American society today. Just very quickly, I want to kind of show some charts because sometimes the numbers don't really bring it home, but these are just a couple of graphs to share with you the rates of these conditions as they're rising over the last few decades. So the chart on the left, you're looking at the rate since 1970. The one that's the most prominent here is obesity. Everybody knows we're having an obesity epidemic. And so you want to see and know and understand that some of these neuroinflammatory conditions are rising concurrently, not necessarily as rapidly or at the same rate, but there is an upward trajectory in all these conditions, whether it's ADHD, depression, autism spectrum disorders, again, depression in children. That's, that to me is just such a profound kind of growth chart to look at, because children are not supposed to be depressed. They're not supposed to be experiencing those kinds of clinical symptoms. And yet here we are, and it's an epidemic on its own. And the chart on the right is showing you just how much it's grown over the last even 20 years. So the chart on the left is over multiple decades. The one on the right is showing this growth over even just a shorter period of time. So that's showing US teenagers who experienced major depression in the last year. And that's such a concerning graph to see. And PANS and PANDAS, again, we don't have a chart for this one to show the growth. And it was only starting to be recognized in the 90s. So something is changing. And I think one way to understand the growth in PANS and PANDAS is to look at other ways that we chart change over time. And this is an example. Here's a chart looking at behavioral health related inpatient visits. And this is broken out by geography, so urban, rural, and suburban, which is interesting of itself, in and of itself. But what you're looking at is the number of inpatient visits, hospitalizations for behavioral health issues. And that's obviously skyrocketing over the last 20 years. Very concerning to see. And one last thing I want to just touch on again is the relationship between conditions like PANS and PANDAS and autism spectrum disorders. And I think if we can understand what's going on with PANS and PANDAS, again, normally developing kids, sudden onset, then have these brain and behavioral symptoms, whereas children with autism, they sort of had these symptoms all along. So because they had these symptoms all along, people presume genetic, brain-based, intractable. There's nothing you can do about it. But actually, that's not the case. And if you can understand that the inflammation in PANS and PANDAS is very similar to the inflammation in autism, you're going to have help for both of these conditions. You're going to find ways to help these children overcome the challenges. And I think it's important for us to know just how much autism has been increasing in the United States. Just like PANS and PANDAS are relatively new diagnoses, autism isn't necessarily a new diagnosis, but the rates of autism in the United States are skyrocketing. And this is one that is over 20 years-ish. This is from 2005 to 2019. This is looking at education data, Department of Education data. So if you look at that line, it's quite concerning. But if you take the long view on autism, since the 1970s, again, from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in this chart says 1 in 36, which is calling on one epidemiological data. The CDC says 1 in 44. The point is, it's a hockey stick of a trajectory upwards. And so we know that there is very concerning rates of growth in these kids. And again, if we can understand the root causes or why this is happening, there is so much we can do to help support these children and these families. So one of the things that's really helping all of these conditions is that there are new areas of research emerging where conditions that were classically known as mental health or psychiatric conditions are now being understood in their functional and physiological roots, like what's going in the body that's causing these symptoms. So, with anything in medical research, there's that bench to bedside gap where new discoveries happen in research institutions and laboratories, and it takes 20, 30 years for that to get into the clinical setting. So what's encouraging is that in the research laboratories, in the academic institutions, you have the development of whole new disciplines that are trying to understand these neuroinflammatory conditions. So disciplines like autoimmune neuropsychiatry, psychoneuroimmunology. These are actually disciplines that are developing where researchers and experts are really trying to understand why the brains are so inflamed and where are these autoimmune conditions coming from that impact the brain and behavior. So that's very exciting to me because we're starting to really understand it and not just sort of put it in the category that it's going to be dealt with by mental health professionals. No, we're understanding why this is happening to people so that we can help them. So one of the things that is pretty well established now, again, maybe not in every clinical setting, but it's understood in terms of medical research and what's happening in these conditions, is that autoimmunity to brain tissue, to the central nervous system, to neural tissue, it's understood as a central feature in many of these conditions. And now it's a matter of getting to how do we stop that inflammation? How do we get to the root of it? What you're looking at in this slide, this is from a paper published by Dr. Rosario Trifletti, who's been one of the leading researchers and physicians trying to help kids with PANS and PANDAS in particular. And what this is showing is autoantibodies, which again are antibodies that are developed by the immune system to attack tissues in our own bodies. That's what an autoantibody is. So the little purple, depictions here of antibodies are binding to specific sites in the brain, in brain tissue. So in this particular situation, what you're looking at is autoantibodies that bind to dopamine receptors in the brain. So just think about that for a second. Usually an antibody binds to a pathogen like Streptococcus or to, Coxsackie or some other kind of pathogen or toxin or something. And that's how your body eliminates these threats. But in this case, you have antibodies that are attacking your own dopamine receptors and causing, all these immune cells to flood in and to create inflammation. So imagine inflammation in and around the dopamine receptors is going to disrupt the dopamine and how it's processed and used by the body. So dopamine, as you know, is a very important neurotransmitter. It's involved in mood, it's involved in behavior, it's involved in motor coordination. So when you see somebody who has like Parkinson's, for instance, is known to be related to altered dopamine. And so Parkinson's is a movement disorder. And you have these kids who have tics. Oftentimes the dopamine receptors are impacted by these autoantibodies, because tics, again, are a motor dysfunction. So it's really important for us to understand what's going on underneath the surface when you see these behaviors that are new or concerning in these children. Here's another depiction of what's going on in PANS, or autoimmune encephalitis. It is a brain on fire. There's inflammation in the brain caused by this autoimmune response, where these autoantibodies are attacking specific sites in the brain. It doesn't have to be dopamine receptors, as I'll talk about in a moment. There's lots of different sites or targets that the immune system goes after. But one of the central things that needs to happen before you start seeing this autoimmune cascade is that there's a breach in the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier, as you probably know, is what protects the brain. It keeps toxins out, it keeps pathogens out, it keeps immune cells out. And so there is a break in that blood-brain barrier that allows that kind of immune response into the brain tissue, and that subsequently results in inflammation. And that's when you see all of the symptoms I've been talking about. So oftentimes in PANS, there is an infectious component, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And when I say infectious, I mean some kind of pathogen, again, like Streptococcus, Mycoplasma. It could be something like a herpes virus or Lyme co-infectors. And I'll explain about that in a second. So this is not unique to PANS and PANDAS. Many of these conditions have been found to have autoantibodies to specific sites. So you don't have to worry about this in too much detail. This chart is just showing that in each of these conditions, researchers have identified specific targets in the brain that the immune system is attacking. So in PANS and PANDAS, as I was just talking about, where the symptoms are behavior, sensory, and motor, the immune system is going after the basal ganglia. And I just showed you in that prior chart, the dopamine receptors, D1 receptor, D2 receptor. These are dopamine receptors. Again, the dopamine receptors are going to impact motor function, sensory function, behavior. So if you take, that kind of model and you apply it to other conditions like autism, the work has just begun here. And already researchers have found so many different targets in the brain for children with autism spectrum disorders. So one very well-known and well-established target in the brain of children with autism spectrum disorders is the cerebral folate receptor. So that's hugely important because your body has so many uses for folate. And if that's disrupted by this autoimmune response and your body's not able to utilize that folate the way that it normally would be, that's going to have all kinds of impacts on this child's functioning. And there are many. I've listed a bunch here in this chart: GABA receptors, et cetera. So it's something that is a burgeoning field of science. And each condition, they're looking at different ones, different sites. So OCD and schizophrenia, some other ones that I've listed here. And this goes on. This isn't just limited to these 4 conditions. I just wanted to give you a snapshot of how much we're now understanding about all of these mental health psychiatric conditions. The brain is attacking, the immune system is attacking different sites in the brain, and it can be very specific. So one of the things that I find encouraging, again, is that people are starting to hear about PANS and PANDAS and what it is. And that means we're going to get more help for kids that are impacted. I wanted to share a little video clip from a segment on ABC News about PANS. This one particularly is about PANDAS, but it gives you kind of a visceral sense of what's going on with these kids. So I'm just going to play a short video.
12-year-old Parker's brain is under attack. Mysterious outbursts that look like mental illness. His parents desperate for answers.
It's okay, Parker.
Recording these horrifying moments, hoping that someone might know what's wrong and how to stop it.
Behave yourself. Way back.
These fits and attacks all suddenly starting after a bout of strep throat.
We've known for a very long time that viruses can trigger mental illness.
Prior Lake, Minnesota. Middle class. Middle America.
Yep.
Parker Barnes is the oldest child in a house full of activity.
4 kids, 2 dogs. We have a small business and we both work besides that, and
Hectic life.
busy life.
His parents, Natalie and Brian, say their son is the kind of kid every parent dreams of having.
Parker, look here. Parker is affable, relaxed. He's got a dry sense of humor. He's very positive.
Oh!
What?
You had to be kidding me!
What?
I'm a fisherman.
Do you sleep up on the top bunk?
Yeah. My nickname that my mom and dad call me is Lead Dog.
But overnight, they say he morphed into something else. A year and a half ago, when he was 10, Parker got strep throat. Within days, strange symptoms appeared.
He had a small throat tick. It just seemed like he never quit clearing his throat. It was minor.
Parker took antibiotics and everything cleared up. But over the next 3 months, 3 rounds of strep.
Parker, what are you talking about?
Each time, mysterious behaviors appeared and got worse.
When he became socially anxious and shut himself off, what was your reaction?
This is strange.
That paralyzing anxiety led to obsessive compulsive behavior.
Don't do that. You're going to hurt yourself on the edge.
No, filming!
Their normally low-key boy suddenly captured by inexplicable rage.
Our son is in the midst of an absolute raging flare. You need to sit down and behave yourself.
The first urgent cry for help came when Parker sent his dad a text message.
Dad, I need you to come home right now. And I ran through the door. He's bawling uncontrollably. And I'm like, what is going on? He's like, I don't know. I can't stop crying. I am horribly sad and I don't know why.
I said, you know what? He's been kind of getting like this when he has strep.
Their doctors recommend seeing a psychologist. Little did anyone know the real crisis was still ahead.
You were about to be blindsided.
Never. Oh.
Yeah, blindsided like you've never.
I could never imagine.
Yeah.
One morning, Parker and his younger brother Stetson were getting ready before school.
I said, well, go brush your teeth. You know, the bus is going to be here in 7 minutes. Let's get you ready out the door. And he starts screaming, oh my God, Parker, what are you doing? He's got a knife. What are you doing, Parker? He's got a knife. Oh my God.
I was the first one to see it.
What did you see?
He had a knife. He was about to, like, literally stab him. He was like, I'm useless. That's what he said. Like, I'm useless. I'm useless.
I just grabbed the knife out and I'm just hugging him like, honey, what is up? What is up with you? Like, this doesn't make sense to me. He's like, I just didn't want me to hurt anybody with the strep anymore. And he said that, and I still didn't put this together. Okay, and I'm like, it's okay, honey. It's just strep throat. It's no big deal. It's just strep throat.
When you were on your way to school and you picked up a knife. Do you remember that?
Yes. I kind of don't remember a lot of it. I don't really like to think about it.
Did you want to hurt yourself?
I don't really know. It's like we didn't, but did. It's like the same thing. It's like there was like, it's like those two thoughts merged. Like they kind of went in war.
Panic.
So I'm just going to stop right there. This segment goes on, and you can find this story on YouTube to hear more about Parker's experience. One of the things that you may have noted, obviously, aside from the drastic change in behavior, the suicidal ideation, wanting to hurt himself, those kinds of things, is that strep throat, right? So all of a sudden, this started after he got about a strep throat. So, that might make you think, oh my gosh, we need to be terrified of strep. And if my child gets strep throat, that something terrible could happen. And remember, for generations, people have gotten strep throat and no one's developed this condition, PANS or PANDAS. No one develops these kind of behavioral symptoms. So there has to be something more than just the strep. So I just want to kind of bookmark that thought for you. And I'm going to come back to that. Because while microbes can be an important part of PANS and PANDAS, they're one piece of what is a very complex condition. But I hope you got a sense from that video of just how devastating this experience can be for these children and for their parents and families. You may also have heard about this. It was a film that was made based on this book, and you might have seen it on Netflix, Brain on Fire. This was a story of a young woman. This woman, it was, I believe, like 24 or 25, something like that, in her young 20s, who developed sudden acute onset psychosis. Now, she didn't get a diagnosis of PANS. She got a slightly different diagnosis, but a form of autoimmune encephalitis, essentially. But her book in this Netflix film really brought attention to the fact that this thing is real and this is happening to more people. And so that to me is, it's obviously a major issue we need to address, but I'm just encouraged that people are beginning to talk about it and trying to understand it more through these things getting into the mainstream news media and into our, field of attention. So one thing I also want to remind everyone is that the central feature here in PANS, autoimmune encephalitis, is neuroinflammation, also in autism. But it's important to think and know and understand that inflammation is not bad. Inflammation isn't, something you need to tamp down or suppress. It is a body's natural response to some kind of threat that the body's under. So it isn't about taking anti-inflammatories like NSAIDs or, Tylenol or something like that to reduce the inflammation. It's let's look and see why there's inflammation in the first place. So let's not suppress the immune system with immunosuppressive drugs or anti-inflammatory drugs. Let's find out what is precipitating or causing that inflammation in the first place, because inflammation has a purpose. There's all sorts of good things that inflammation do in terms of, regular, normal brain function, and we need inflammation, but we don't need it to be chronic, and we don't need it to be so devastating when it gets into the brain and there's targets in the neural tissue that there shouldn't be. So it's important to start thinking, why is my brain on fire? Why is there this chronic, unrelenting inflammation in the brain? So let's talk about what some of the causes of PANDAS are. Why are these children's and adults too, as I mentioned with the Brain on Fire book and movie, this is hitting adults too. So why is the brain on fire? One of the things, again, I want to emphasize is there's often an infectious component. So again, it could be a strep throat, like you heard about in Parker's story. It could be Lyme disease or one of the Lyme co-infectors. And there's many different co-infectors that precipitate symptoms that we call Lyme, Babesia, Bartonella, there's Ehrlichia, there's all different kinds of microbes that are responsible for that whole syndrome. Those are often at play in PANS and PANDAS. Typically, when you go in to have a child assessed for the root causes of the PANS and PANDAS symptoms, you will find these microbes are off the charts, elevated levels of all these microbes that you wouldn't find in a neurotypical child without these symptoms. So the infectious component is very much real, but it isn't the whole piece, because lots of kids actually are exposed to strep. They're exposed to Babesia, Borrelia, Mycoplasma, but their bodies handle it, right? And it doesn't necessarily make its way into the brain. So what is it that makes a child vulnerable to this? And so that is, to me, one of the most important features of PANS and PANDAS is that the kids are at a predisposition, meaning that their bodies are in a place where they have reduced resilience. So how does that happen? Their immune systems aren't strong enough to fight off these microbes on their own. And sometimes that happens because of nutritional deficiencies. Sometimes there's excessive stress or emotional trauma. Their immune system isn't working oftentimes because of the health of the gut. I'm going to get a lot into detail in the gut and the microbiome. The microbiome and the gastrointestinal tract is the seat of immune health. And many people who develop autoimmune diseases, whether that's rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, alopecia, or whether it's autism, which is an autoimmune condition, you have disturbances in the gut bacteria. One other feature of PANS, which is extremely important, is what I alluded to before, is that there's been a breach of the blood-brain barrier. So if you think about that sudden onset that I talk about, usually that's because there's something that caused the blood-brain barrier to break down, maybe to allow those infectious agents in, to allow the toxins into the brain tissue. And then the immune system does its job and goes in and tries and gets rid of those toxins or those infections. So the breach of the blood-brain barrier can happen by physical trauma. So everybody knows somebody who's had a concussion. When the concussion happens, the blood-brain barrier opens because the immune system needs to get in and do its job and get rid of cellular debris and waste and product of inflammation and repair cells. So concussions can open the blood-brain barrier, head traumas, car accidents, things like that. Also, there's a whole series of medicines that can open up the blood-brain barrier. And one of the most well-known and well-established ones is antibiotics, especially broad-spectrum antibiotics. Things like Augmentin or Cipro, those are broad-spectrum antibiotics, which really can compromise the blood-brain barrier as well. What is very not yet well-known is that excessive EMF exposure, electromagnetic radiation, things from cell phones and Wi-Fi, 5G, these things can open the blood-brain barrier as well. So that's something to take into consideration. So in essence, in order for this to develop in any one individual, it's really kind of a perfect storm. You have to have the reduced resilience, low vitamin D, nutrient deficiencies. You have to have an immune system that's compromised, usually because of the gut bacteria. I'll talk about that in a second. Plus the blood-brain barrier breach, plus an infection or toxin that is ready and primed to get into the brain and neural tissue. So it's really a perfect storm of factors, which is why it doesn't happen to every kid who gets strep throat, right? It's just those kids who happen to have these other factors at the same time. So the sudden onset, if you think about that, as I was just talking about, you want to think about what happened. If you know somebody who has this kind of condition, you want to sort of take a medical history and think about what happened before the onset. And it isn't always one thing, right? Like, again, it could be a concussion. It could be that this child had some kind of emotional trauma, like a parent or a grandparent that they were close to passing. It could be a round of antibiotics, and that's very common. And you'll see that, the child got strep throat, they got the antibiotics to treat the strep throat, and then it all of a sudden just turns into this cascade of behavioral problems. The one thing to notice is that the brain inflammation isn't the only inflammation. Typically, when you have this sudden onset of inflammation in the brain, there's inflammation in the whole body. It's a whole body system-wide kind of phenomenon that's going on. So the good part about all of this is that if you know that there is all of this inflammation going on, and you know that there are certain things that cause inflammation, that you can actually start working on those causes of inflammation, again, from a whole body perspective, to help the body heal, to help these symptoms go away, to help a child's body recover. So there are so many now, I mean, 10 years ago, maybe not, but so many anecdotal stories now of people who have fully reversed many different types of chronic health conditions, psychiatric conditions, conditions that were believed to be solely genetic, conditions that have inflammation as a primary component. So a couple examples that are really well known, Dr. Terry Walls, who is a physician in the University of Wisconsin, who developed MS, and she was wheelchair bound. And then she learned that her body was inflamed, right? So for her, it was a brain on fire, but it had a whole body component. And she learned that there were certain things in her diet that were causing that inflammation. So she created this whole anti-inflammatory diet, which was really about taking out things like wheat and sugar and dairy, processed foods, GMOs, things like that. And she created what's now been known as the Walls protocol, and she reversed her MS. She no longer has MS, and she treats people using this protocol, and she has physician trainings and trains other physicians how to do this. She's very well known for this, and this was, again, with regard to MS, which is, for so long believed to be this genetic condition that it's progressive, it's degenerative. There's nothing you can do about it, and that's not the case. There's also tons of anecdotal stories of children fully reversing their autism diagnoses. And I've been collecting these for about 10, 12 years. And kids who were diagnosed, well-established autism diagnosis, who followed anti-inflammatory diets and other kinds of therapeutic modalities that address inflammation and whole body imbalances, and they reversed their conditions. And perhaps one that's been more well-known recently is Dr. Katie Reed. She did a TED Talk called Unblind My Mind, where she actually reduced her child's autism, reversed the symptoms of her child's autism by using a low free glutamate diet, taking glutamate out of the diet. And so this was also an attempt to reduce the inflammation and the root causes of inflammation in her child's diet. So these are things that have been around for a while, and they're not really that new or that controversial. But with regard to PANS and PANDAS, I think there's more we can do to try and understand how to help these kids by getting to the root causes. So whether it's autism, ADHD, anxiety, OCD, Tourette's, PANS, PANDAS, whatever the chronic inflammatory condition is, and this goes for things that are that don't involve the brain necessarily. So rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, where the symptoms are predominantly elsewhere in the body. You take the same root causes kind of approach. You take a whole child or a whole person approach, and that's the key to treatment and recovery and reversal of these symptoms. So where do you start? You start by trying to understand, where are the imbalances in the body, and what can we do to regulate those, bring the body back into balance? So I started looking at this approach when I learned that no matter what the diagnosis is, you can see common underlying physiological imbalances. So if you have a child who has obesity or autism or depression, 3 very different conditions. But if you look under the hood and you do some laboratory diagnostics and you really try and understand what's going on underneath the surface, in the cells, in the body, you see the same things. So decreased diversity of microbiome is one, inflammation, cellular toxicity, increased oxidative stress. And that's, everyone knows that it's important to take antioxidants, right? Like eat those blueberries because they're antioxidants. Well, that's to counter the effects oxidative stress, which is free radicals floating around the body and destroying cells. Immune dysregulation, impaired nutrient status, that's a major category. Impaired detoxification. And there's all kinds of reasons why these things happen. It's a function of the way that we're living in the modern world. And I could spend a whole other, couple hours just talking about how living in the modern world creates all of these imbalances. But the frank reality is that all of our kids, regardless of the diagnosis, have some kind of physiological imbalances that fall into these categories. And so if you know what the imbalances are, then you can begin to help try and set things straight again, to try and bring the body back into balance. Something like nutrition, if you know there's nutritional deficiencies, well, that can very easily be brought back into balance through nutritional supplementation and diet. So let's talk about some of the root causes of PANDS. I want to start with the microbiome, because this is probably the most important root cause of PANDS, PANDAS, autism, any of these conditions. The human microbiome, which is all the microbes in and around our body, but especially in the gastrointestinal system. This is massively important for every kind of new chronic health condition that we're seeing in our kids, and neurobehavioral, neuroinflammatory conditions. So what that basically means is that the microbes in our gut, they're supposed to be diverse. Like you think about like a rich garden with different kinds of soils and plants and animals and microbes. And, it's a rich, diverse ecology. Our guts really are supposed to be like that too. There's supposed to be diversity. There's supposed to be many different types of bacteria and yeast and viruses even are in our microbiome. And so when that gets out of whack, typically through antibiotics or proton pump inhibitors, which are the reflux medications, or hormone and steroid medication. So for instance, if a child has asthma and they take an asthma inhaler, that disrupts the gut bacteria. And that a diet high in sugar, inflammatory oils, chemicals, like pesticides on food, glyphosate, these things all affect the gut bacteria. So it's cumulative, right? So, the more toxic stuff you eat, the more antibiotics you take, the worse that gut dysbiosis is. Gut dysbiosis just means an imbalance in the bacteria in the gut. So gut dysbiosis is probably one of the most important features of all of these conditions, especially in PANDS and PANDAS. When you see a kid who gets this diagnosis, typically if you did a stool sample or you go in and you, measure what's in their gut, it's usually not in balance. It's usually not as diverse as it should be. Second major feature I talked about already is infections. So again, like the strep, the Lyme. Another one I didn't mention yet, which is hugely important, is mold. And sometimes mold is a trigger for these kids. So, they're in a moldy home and it didn't bother them until that blood-brain barrier breach, until that gut disruption. And then all of a sudden that mold becomes a really big problem because it gets into the neural tissue. Nutrient deficiencies. This is one that is ubiquitous in American society. Most kids, if you test them, have nutritional deficiencies, even if you think they're eating a really great diet. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It has to do with sort of the depletion of minerals in our soil. It has to do with the processing of food and how that reduces the nutrient density of our foods. It has to do with the fact that most Americans eat processed instead of whole foods. So nutrient deficiencies, the ones that are really common, vitamin D, and that's because we don't go outside. That like human beings used to live outside all the time, and now we live indoors. And so we don't get vitamin D from the sun. Zinc is massively important in these conditions. Zinc deficiencies, iron, magnesium, essential fatty acids, the list goes on. So this is a really important area where kids are deficient that makes them vulnerable. And then the dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system. This is how kids get stuck in PANDS, right? Like their body is incredibly intelligent and it wants to reestablish balance all the time. Like that's what it drives to. But these kids with these conditions, they get stuck in this cycle of, incredible stress. I mean, you saw that video with Parker, that kid's body is just in this cycle of fight or flight. He never has the opportunity to sort of rest. And that's in the nervous system, there's kind of like a switch. You're either in parasympathetic or sympathetic state. And so a lot of these kids are permanently in the sympathetic state, which is fight or flight. So you have to be in a state of parasympathetic rest and digest, rest and repair, in order for all of that, repair to happen to the brain, for the body to reestablish order. And so if you cannot get your body into that, parasympathetic state, you're never going to have the opportunity to heal. So those are some of the main features of what's going on. This is not an exhaustive list. Sometimes there's more going on. And as an example, sometimes there's a really big emotional piece for kids, and that is what keeps them in a sympathetic state. Or the emotional piece is what opens up the blood-brain barrier. So there can be other components, but these are really the biggies. And, I mentioned how big and important the gut microbiome is. And I want to spend just a minute talking about that, because I cannot overstate how important this is to the treatment and recovery of kids impacted with these conditions, because the microbiome is so central to immune function in our bodies. So here's a graphic depiction of all the things that the microbiome is responsible for. It's not all the things. The microbiome is responsible for many, many more functions in our body, but these are some big ones. And so I think the most important ones that I want to highlight are that, like, your microbiome, microbes in your gut, are important for helping you digest and extract nutrients from your food. They help actually make their own kinds of vitamins, like certain B vitamins are made by the bacteria. So if you don't have the bacteria there, you can't get those microbes, those nutrients into your body. The microbes actually create a barrier to protect you from different infectious agents getting into your circulatory system. So they almost provide like a carpet of protection. They help regulate the immune system. So your immune system can be turned on or turned off by these microbes. So if you think about these kids who are in a constant state of like autoimmunity and this like revved up immune system, their immune system is not being regulated by those microbes. The immune system is not being shut off by the microbes, sometimes because they're missing. And why are they missing? Again, think back to the chemicals, antibiotics, and the other things that wiped out these good gut bacteria that we have. Another really key feature of the microbiome that I just want to touch on is detoxification. Microbes in your gut actually help you detoxify toxins as they come in through your mouth. And you excrete them from your body when you have good, robust gut bacteria. So things like mercury or lead or cadmium, these kinds of known toxins to your body, the microbes actually help bring them out of your body. So if you don't have the right balance of microbes, you're not going to be able to detoxify. And the last thing I'll mention of really profound importance is the role in the development of neurotransmitters. So for instance, serotonin, which we know is so important for mood, behavior, and sleep. And again, think about these conditions and how many problems these kids have with mood, behavior, and sleep. You have, if you don't have the right balance of microbes in your gut, you're not going to produce the serotonin. 90% of the serotonin that you use, which is a neurotransmitter, again, for regulating all these things. If you don't have the right balance of microbes, you're not going to produce the serotonin that you need to regulate mood, behavior, sleep. So I cannot emphasize enough the role of all of these microbes. So again, this is just some of the really key portions. One last piece, which I didn't mention, is that if the microbes are out of balance, it impacts the function of the gastrointestinal tract. In other words, like, we don't really think a lot about it. The food goes in and, we excrete stool, but what happens in between? And so a lot of problems begin when there's constipation or diarrhea, or, there's no proper function of that, digestion and the waste products moving out. And that becomes exacerbated or worse if you don't have a good balance of diverse microbes in your gut. So it's another really important feature of the microbiome and what the microbiome does. One of the things I also want to highlight about the microbiome is that when you have that, I was describing that kind of carpet that protects the gastrointestinal tract. It keeps toxins out. It keeps various types of infectious microbes out. When you get a breakdown in that carpet of protection of good microbes, you can get something called leaky gut, sort of a colloquial term for what a physician might call intestinal hyperpermeability, which means things are getting into the circulatory system, which is what this little graphic here is depicting. Things are getting into the circulatory system that are not supposed to. And interestingly, you commonly see, if you have a leaky gut, you also have a leaky brain. So you can imagine what I mean by leaky brain. That's a breakdown in the blood-brain barrier. There are these things called tight junctions, which keep the epithelial cells close and tight, and again, providing this protective barrier. And when you get a breakdown in the gut, you can also get a breakdown in the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier. So these two things, the gut and the brain, are like so tightly intertwined. And so if you have gut dysbiosis, chances are you might also have leaky brain. And that is, again, going back to blood-brain barrier, a breach that we talked about earlier. So you don't have to digest everything on this slide, but what this is illustrating is that if you can identify the imbalances in the body, there are very specific treatments and therapeutics that you can use to bring everything back into balance again, whether that's targeted biochemical or nutritional kinds of strategies, or whether it's lifestyle changes or maybe specific therapies that you can use. So here's just a couple examples of neuroinflammatory conditions where you can identify the imbalance and then you can bring things back into balance through very targeted therapies. So let's take anxiety, for example, the first one here. So some of the things that are well documented to be out of balance in anxiety is you have gut dysbiosis. You have nutrient imbalances. So for instance, oftentimes there's low levels of zinc and essential fatty acids in anxiety. There are autoantibodies to brain tissues with anxiety. So those are imbalances, right? So how do we fix that? What do we do to address that? So there's lots of different things you can do. Let's take the microbiome, for instance. The most important thing you can do to help address microbiome dysbiosis, to get that gut bacteria back in shape, is through diet changes. So things that help support a robust microbiome are diverse sets of foods. So if you eat just one class of foods, like lots of carbohydrates or lots of sugars or lots of processed foods, you're not going to have a robust microbiome. A robust microbiome requires lots of different diversity of, especially fibrous foods, maybe different types of meats and fats, or a diversity of clean organic foods. And also things that have been eaten by humans for thousands of years, for millennia, are fermented foods. And fermented foods are things that have natural, probiotic gut bacteria. And those kinds of foods can help restore the microbiome. Supplementation, of course, is what you often can do when you see a nutritional deficiency. So if you have a low level, you can get tested. There's blood tests that you can do. You can have a low level of zinc, vitamin D, and magnesium, let's say. You can take nutritional supplements, or you can eat a lot of foods that have those kinds of nutrients. So for instance, you find out you have low zinc, you can eat a lot of oysters. Oysters are a wonderful source of zinc, as an example. And this is also what Terry Walls did with her MS, right? So she ate an anti-inflammatory diet. She ate things to help restore her microbiome. Anxiety isn't just about gut bacteria either, though. None of these conditions are just about gut bacteria. There's also sort of the whole body things that need to be taken into consideration. So like trauma, for instance, there can be all kinds of emotional trauma that's sort of under the surface that sometimes need to be addressed as you're repairing the physical aspects of the body. Sometimes people also need to have more emotional, psychosocial elements addressed. So for instance, there are many modalities for helping people overcome trauma. EMDR is an example of one. That's a rapid eye movement technique that many psychiatrists and psychologists will use. EFT, emotional freedom technique, that's a tapping you might have heard of. There's a wonderful therapy called Safe and Sound, which is a listening therapy that helps to tone the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is the nerve that connects the brain and the gut, and is so important for moving us from a sympathetic state into a parasympathetic state. So there's just so many amazing resources out there. And this is just sort of a sampling of the different types of things you can do. The point of this slide is just to show, find the imbalances, address the imbalances, and then look for the therapies that might help regulate and restore balance in the body. So a couple other things I didn't mention are some of the lifestyle things that people can do. So I already mentioned removing inflammatory foods. So things like wheat, sugar, sometimes eggs, depending, sometimes vegetable oils. Like vegetable oils are such a baddie when it comes to inflammation in the body. So those things like, canola oil or cottonseed oil or, the different kinds of corn oil, those things are terrible for inflammation. So those things need to come out of the diet because they're, eating them routinely causes inflammation. But one other lifestyle feature I did not mention is movement and exercise. So the number one way to reduce oxidative stress in the body, again, there's free radicals floating around destroying the cells and causing inflammation. Number one way to reduce it is exercise. It doesn't need to mean like going running a marathon. You don't need to go and play in a sports team. You can do yoga. You can do any kind of movement-based exercise. Movement is profoundly important for bringing inflammation down in the body. And then another area of importance is sleep. So it's something we as Americans, I think, don't prize as much as we should. I think that sleep is under-recognized as an important therapeutic tool for people who are struggling with chronic health conditions. Only in the less than 10 years, it's really only I think been like eight or 9 years that was discovered. They discovered the glymphatic system. So they didn't know up until recently that the brain actually has a lymphatic system. All right, we know about lymphatics in our body. That's how we get, sort of drain and move a lot of those immune cells, and we drain toxins through our lymphatic system, and that's how we get, detox. The brain needs to detox too. So when you think about it, if there's been some kind of injury to the brain, whether that's again like a concussion or a breach to the blood-brain barrier, and the microbes are getting in there, and there's inflammation in there. When you have inflammation, you're creating all kinds of cellular debris and cellular wastes. And those need to get out of the brain. The brain will not heal if you have all that cellular debris in there. So when does that happen? It happens at night when you're sleeping. So if you don't sleep, the lymphatic system does not drain all of those cellular waste and toxins out. So, again, if you're feeling like there's some kind of chronic health condition that isn't resolving, if you're not sleeping, you're not doing your body any service. So sleep is critically important to allow your body to get rid of all those wastes. I also listed here some other common anti-inflammatory supplements that people take. And when I say anti-inflammatory, I don't necessarily mean it's suppressing the immune response. It's more working with your body to help manage inflammation. So things like turmeric, CBD oil, it's a cannabis oil, N-acetylcysteine, NAC, ALA, alpha lipoic acid, vitamin C, critically important as an anti-inflammatory supplement, vitamin E, vitamin D, essential fatty acids, especially things like cod liver oil. Melatonin is an antioxidant. So these are all anti-inflammatory supplements that can help bring that inflammation down in the body. And again, the last piece I'll mention is that if your body is struggling to eliminate an infection like strep, or these Lyme co-infectors, sometimes there are antimicrobial strategies you can use. A lot of physicians like Sue Suedo, again with the NIH, and others who've been sort of tracking this PANDAS and PANS phenomenon tend to go to antibiotics to fight the infections in PANS and PANDAS. And while that may help bring the infection down in the short term, just remember that there's a consequence, a long-term problem with that. So, because you're affecting the microbiota. So, I've talked to many families who've had success, and many clinicians working with these families who've had success using herbal antimicrobials. So things like berberine or cat's claw or other kinds of things that target the microbes, but don't necessarily destroy the microbiome. So that's an important thing to be thinking about as possible antimicrobial therapy to deal with the infections. So again, I will bring this back to, it's not, in conventional medicine, we're very used to one diagnosis and like one set of drugs that we can take to fix this or to address this. That's really kind of a symptom suppressive model. Like, oh, you have pain, so I'm going to give you an anti-inflammatory to suppress the inflammation. That is a different approach. This is an approach where you look at all the different things happening in and around your life and trying to maximize your body's resilience in order to basically allow the body to do the healing on its own. Trust your body knows what to do if you give it the right supports and you remove as many of the stressors as possible. So what we call this is total load, that your body is like kind of like a barrel and it only has so much capacity to handle toxins or stress or infections or what have you. And what you want to do is reduce as many of those exposures as possible to keep your immune system so it's not overloaded. And at the same time, you want to do all the things you can to build the resilience in your body. And that's sleep and movement, exercise, going into nature, getting natural sunlight without sunblock, all these kinds of things that human bodies have done for thousands of years and have been very healthy doing. We don't do these things anymore. So we need to reintegrate some of the more natural and health supporting activities that human beings evolved to do. So if you think about kind of the big picture, what are some, no matter what the neuroinflammatory condition is, so again, whether it's PANS, PANDAS, whether it's autism, ADHD, what are some of the things that you want to do to help any of these conditions? So the first thing is start by reducing your total load. So that's looking at anything that might be causing stress, or it might stimulate the immune system in a negative way. So that can be removing food allergens that most people don't even know they have. Like you might have a sensitivity to wheat or dairy or corn or soy or something like that. And every time you eat that food, it's causing inflammation in your body and your body has to deal with it. So the goal is to bring as many of those inflammatory experiences out of your body as possible. And it's personal, it's case by case. It isn't everybody's, reacting to wheat or everybody's reacting to dairy. It's like, what is it for you? Because everybody's different. This also reducing total load also means taking out toxic products, personal care products, things that have chemicals in them in your soap, shampoos, laundry detergent, stop using sunscreen, anything that might be putting toxins into your body. And also looking around in your environment. Very few people, for instance, when they move into a new home or apartment, they don't test their water, they don't test their air, they don't look around to see what's around the environment that might be toxic. But chances are most people are exposed to toxins in their daily life. And if we can start understanding what some of those toxins are and reduce our exposures, that's going to help your immune system do its job better. Second key strategy for all of these conditions is the gut healing and the microbiome repair, which I talked a little bit about. Number one way to do that is through diet, especially fermented foods. And then I already mentioned increasing sort of the general lifestyle health supports. Get outside, get some sleep, do some exercise. And then for sure, kids who have PANS and PANDAS sometimes need more intensive therapeutics, like going outside and changing your diet and sleeping isn't going to necessarily fix these kids or help them regulate again. Sometimes you need a little bit more, especially kids with autism spectrum disorders where there's rehabilitative work that needs to be done. Regulating the nervous system is profoundly important. So again, trying to figure out ways to use therapies to get the body from that sympathetic state, fight or flight, into the parasympathetic state, which is the sort of rest and digest or rest and repair kind of state. And I mentioned a few, like the safe and sound therapy as an example, or trauma therapy can be helpful that way as well. Also, to dive a little bit deeper, it's important to put your brain around thinking functionally and bioindividually. So, you can look at a whole host of conditions, and there's lots of medical literature on common nutrient deficiencies seen in this condition. So I gave you a couple examples. So like in tinnitus, which is that incessant ear ringing, it's commonly known to be, there is a vitamin B12 deficiency commonly seen in people who have this condition. Or in ADHD, most kids with ADHD have a zinc deficiency, an essential fatty acid deficiency, and a magnesium deficiency. Very common. Sensory processing, magnesium, hyperesthesia, which is a sensory sensitivity, B12 deficiency. So like this is documented in the medical literature. It's very common. So you want to think functionally, again, like what's deficient and how can I repair that, or how can I get that back in balance? But don't take that as like rule of law, because we are bio-individuals. And just because you have ADHD doesn't mean you are also deficient in zinc, or you are also deficient in essential fatty acids. That's a place to start, but you kind of want to think about testing yourself as a bio-individual, because I'm different from you and things I've been exposed to are different from you and what I eat is different from you. So you really have to look at each individual person as their own personal case. And there's no one size fits all for anything. There's no protocol that everybody can follow. So this may sound kind of overwhelming, like, what do I do? How do I find out what functionally is imbalanced? What are the physiological imbalances for me or for my child? So one of the very first things you can do is you can go get some routine laboratory diagnostics done. And many of these sort of basic ones can be even covered by insurance. So I listed a few here that you could just go get basic blood work done. Ask your primary care physician for these kinds of tests just to see what might be out of balance. So you can get, and these are not expensive, and they're covered by most insurance. So you can get CBC, which is a basic blood count, liver and kidney function. You can find out about electrolytes and fluids, vitamin D. And by the way, most people are vitamin D deficient. Fatty acids, you can look at your thyroid, hemoglobin A1C, which is a measurement of blood sugar over time. That's a really important one because spikes in blood sugar can cause all kinds of inflammation in the body. Iron, lead, and other metals that are commonly tested for in conventional medical settings. You can look for strep. If you have a child who has one of these neuroinflammatory conditions, you can look to see if strep might be at play. You can also get some very basic Lyme tests that aren't necessarily exhaustive. Like, they're not going to identify all the different types of microbes and co-infectors that are often present in Lyme, or what's often called Lyme. But you can get some basics. And then also you can do some basic genetic testing. So there are all kinds of genetic polymorphisms that actually create predispositions or vulnerability for people. So there's one that you may have heard of, or one type of a genetic mutation called MTHFR, which will, about 40% of Caucasian people, for instance, have that genetic mutation. And that actually means that you may have a reduced capacity to detoxify. That's important to know. And there's certain like B vitamins you can take to help overcome that. So that can be important information to know. In addition to that, there are also specialized boutique labs, typically not covered by insurance, but you can go deeper. You can find really complex panels of nutrient analysis. So you can find out what kind of nutrient deficiencies that you have. You can do all kinds of analysis of your gut microbiome. So there's stool tests you can do. And then there are specific tests you can do, especially for PANS and PANDAS, to find out what autoantibodies you have to your brain tissue. So there's a physician named Marion Cunningham, who created a panel called the Cunningham panel, which looks for specific types of autoantibodies, which helps explain maybe why you might have certain symptoms if you have positive test results from the Cunningham panel. There's a company called Molecular Labs that you can look into for that sort of thing. And there are all kinds of labs that will look very specifically for infection. So again, a lot of those like Babesia, Borrelia, Ehrlichiosis, Mycoplasma, all these kinds of Lyme co-infectors. There's a company called Vibrant Wellness, for instance, that you can get tested looking for those kinds of infections. So the next thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that there are so many stories of children who have overcome these challenges, especially with regard to PANS and PANDAS. So I was a co-author on a book called Brain Under Attack that came out a couple of years ago. And in this book, we wrote this for parents. It's meant to be sort of a guide to help parents overcome the challenges with their children, help their children get on the road to recovery and restoration of their health. In this book, we have several stories where parents have shared their experiences of how their child recovered from PANS and PANDAS. So I wanted to share with you just one story. This is a story of Pamela, and her son was diagnosed with PANDAS. And she got him all the way better. And as a result, she actually started a company where she has a couple of supplements that are meant for gut repair and helping restore your immune system. She was so profoundly moved by the experience she had in bringing her son through his healing journey that she sort of made it her life's work. You can learn more about her at hello.health, but I'm going to have you listen to Pamela and just hear her story.
Hi, this is Pamela Worth, founder of Hello Health, and I'm coming to you from Arizona. Wanted to explain how we started Hello Health and why it really began as a journey trying to figure out why my son was reacting the way he was. He had gone from this perfectly normal child, age 5, to baby talking, crawling, eyes constantly dilated, devoid of all emotion, really sad, would hide under the desk at school, would sleep a lot of hours, and we couldn't understand what was going on. Went to a number of different doctors. They would say things like, kids will be kids, it's just allergies. When we put him on Prozac, he seems depressed. Another doctor said, when we put him in observation for 2 weeks at the hospital, another doctor said, you know, he's autistic now. You're going to have to take care of him the rest of his life. And then that's when things just felt really hard and really heavy. And went on a quest to find a doctor that wanted to understand why. And I found out that there are doctors called integrative and functional that look at the whole body. So found a integrative neurologist because I figured if it was affecting, you know, mood and motor and vocal, it must be neurology. So this neurologist pulled blood, found that he had an active viral infection, bacterial infection, low D3, low B12, and a genetic marker called MTHFR. The viral infection was a common infection in school-age children, apparently, called CMV. The bacterial infection was strep, even though he'd never ever had strep throat before and still tested negative for strep throat, which was crazy and wild. And the way the doctor explained it was these vitamin deficiencies basically put his immune system at a major disadvantage to fight these infections, which had crossed the blood-brain barrier and had triggered these motor, vocal, and mood disorders. So we went on a quest to figure out, and then she said it's massive inflammation is really what's going on. So if you can control the inflammation, you can control the virus, control the bacteria, and get the vitamin levels back up, you're going to be fine. So it seemed really daunting. She assured us everything was going to be fine. It took about a year, and our son is back, and he hasn't left us since. Many years later, and it was through these supplements that this neurologist told us how to take and when to take and how to take, and a collaboration with formulators, manufacturers, non-GMO, organic suppliers, that we, and gluten-free, that we created Hello Health's Belly Great and Mighty Might. So I would just encourage you to stay on your why. Please don't give up. And you too will experience great health. Thank you.
So that's Pamela, who's a friend of mine, and like I said, made it her mission for helping other families now that she's come out on the other side of this. I'd like to show you another video. This is a video that was posted to YouTube. You can see this on YouTube as well, by Dr. Sabine Hazan, who's a gastroenterologist in Southern California. She does microbiome analysis. So she does actually genetic sequencing of the microbes in the gut and is doing really profound, amazing work. This was one of her patients who came to her with a sudden onset of Tourette's-like symptoms and was diagnosed with PANDAS. And I'm going to let you watch this video a little bit, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about Dr. Hazan.
Stop. Where do you feel it? In your neck? What do you mean, where do I feel it? I don't feel anything. It's just happening. I don't understand. Okay. We're almost home. Puppy. Please stop screaming!
Okay. Like totally stuck.
Okay, so there's some key takeaways from this story. And you can read about this story. This case study was published not too long ago in the Journal of Infectious Diseases and Therapy, again by Dr. Sabine Hazan, gastroenterologist, Southern California. Some of the key takeaways in this experience was the sudden onset for this child. Again, we've talked about how that is typical with PANDS, and she obviously had Tourette's-like syndrome as well. And, she obviously had nutritional deficiencies. And what's interesting about this was the first line of therapy they did is they prescribed her antibiotics and gave her nutritional supplements. And that wasn't enough. And it was kind of trying to figure out what was it that was still there and still a problem. And Dr. Sabine Hazan has actually been really breaking new ground, because she is, in this case, she illustrates how this child was tested for SARS-CoV-2 via PCR, and it came up negative, 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 even though it had been in the home. So Dr. Hazan had speculated that SARS-CoV-2 was present, and so was causing some kind of precipitation of symptoms. She eventually isolated it in the stool. So Dr. Hazan's one of the few physicians who's doing DNA sequencing of SARS-CoV-2 and finding it in people's stools, even when their PCR tests are negative. So it's an interesting finding. And then obviously one of the things that happened in this child's therapy was that she continued to get nutritional support, nutritional supplements, high doses of vitamin C, but also she got fermented foods, right? Putting yogurt and different kinds of fermented foods. What Dr. Hazan focuses on is the microbiome. So her effort to support this child was focusing in on strengthening and diversifying the microbiome. And as you may have read in that last slide, that was really what brought her back to normalcy, was the high dose vitamin C and the diet changes that put in the fermented foods and the yogurt. And she tested her microbiome at the end, and the microbiome had been somewhat restored. So I think this is really cutting edge stuff, and you can learn more about Dr. Hazan. You can Google her and see some of her work. She's a bunch of NIH sponsored clinical trials looking at microbiome restoration, including fecal microbiome transplant. And that's basically using somebody else's stool and the microbes in their gut and bringing that to somebody else, like you would an organ transplant. It's transplanting the microbes from one person to another. So really profound stuff there. Again, highlighting the importance of the microbiome and how much that needs to be balanced in order to have proper immune function, so you can overcome things like a SARS-CoV-2 infection or a strep infection or what have you. So to me, the stories of these kids' successes, the stories of these recoveries, of these children overcoming these challenges, no matter what the neuroinflammatory, neurobehavioral condition might be, that's profoundly important. And we need to follow what those kids are doing. And so I've always wanted to know, if we have this massive epidemic of neuroinflammatory chronic health conditions in kids, and we know that some of them anecdotally are reversing these conditions, why isn't this commonly known? Why do people not go to their pediatrician and get instructions on how to reverse these things? What is it that we need to do to get the help to the people? So my nonprofit organization, Epidemic Answers, started a research project called Documenting Hope. And our purpose was to begin documenting the hope of reversal and recovery for kids so that we could make it more available to physicians, make it more available to families. So we have 2 IRB approved research studies. IRB means that they've been reviewed by an ethics and safety and scientific rigor standard. And both of these studies are underway right now. The first study is called CHIRP. It stands for Child Health Inventory for Resilience and Prevention. And it's basically documenting and cataloging all the things that are in children's lives in the modern world and how they correlate to health outcomes. In other words, we have an online survey that parents take, and we ask questions about everything they do on a daily basis, what they're eating, what they're thinking, what they're putting on their skin. And then we also ask about symptoms and diagnoses, et cetera. And that study is open to any parent who has a child between the ages of 1 and 15 in the United States. So if you have one, you can go to documentinghope.com and look for the CHIRP study there, and you can participate. Our second study is called the FLIGHT study, and this one is a longitudinal study, which is looking, taking a small group of children who have one of these neuroinflammatory conditions or chronic health condition like a rheumatoid arthritis or anxiety, depression, those sorts of things. And then we're bringing them through an 18-month program where we are going to use personalized interventions. That may include diet, may include cleaning up their environment, it may include personalized therapeutics, like some of the things I was talking about, like the polyvagal safe and sound therapy would be an example of a personalized therapeutic that one child might need. So we're bringing these children through a program to try and restore balance in their bodies. We're going to be documenting their changes over time, things that you can measure in blood, urine, stool. So we'll be watching their nutritional status change. We'll be watching their inflammatory markers go down, hopefully. And we're also documenting this on film, because at the end, we want to be able to tell the stories of these children via film so that we can encourage and inspire other families to seek these resources that are out there. They're just not well known by most people. So you can learn more about these studies. You can participate in the CHIRP study. The FLIGHT study is recruiting participants between the ages of 2 and 15 in Northern Virginia only right now. We may be opening a second site. So you please do go check out documentinghope.com. And I'm going to conclude with a short video, which is just me explaining this project, the Documenting Hope project, and what our aims are. So I'm just gonna play that video and see you on the other side.
Humans, we have a problem. The way we are living in the modern world, the things we do every day, are making us all very, very sick. Even the people in the most resourced countries, those that seem to have the best shot at living a healthy and vibrant life, have the highest chronic disease burden and the highest rate of obesity. And what's worse, the most resourced among us have the sickest kids, the little humans that by design should be the healthiest, right? I don't think people realize what a big deal this is. I don't think they realize what a tsunami of problems we will be facing in the future if we do not tackle this right now. My organization has been studying this problem for a long time. We decided to raise some money and do some research to better understand this problem. And we found out a few things. We found out that it isn't any one thing that is making us sick. It's a whole bunch of things, all making the other things worse. It's the cumulative and synergistic effect of living in the modern world that is making our kids sick. The good news is this: if these conditions develop because of the way we're living, then that means there is something we can do about it. For years, we've been capturing the stories of kids who have made recoveries from all types of conditions, even the ones they tell you are genetic or lifelong. And we've been closely studying what those kids did to heal. We've learned that health is about much more than just genes, and it is not about avoiding scary germs. Come on, those are old ideas, and they don't explain the exponential increase in the number of kids that have chronic health and developmental conditions today. Humans, we've lost our way. We've missed the bus. We think that by spending a lot of money on big medical centers and fancy new technologies that we're going to be able to find the secret to health. The truth is, the secret to health has been here all along. Maybe if we remain humble, honor nature and our planet, and the balance that our bodies need. Maybe if we really reconnect with what it means to be human, just maybe we can return to health. The thing is, we know that healing is possible. We've documented true stories of hope, stories of kids who have completely overcome developmental delays and challenges. Children who had rheumatoid arthritis, who had life-threatening food allergies, who had cancer, but then got better and are living their lives without medication. And still, most people don't know that this is even possible. So we're doing an ambitious research study, not only to demonstrate that it is possible, but also to show how it happens. Our goal is to help a small group of families help their children overcome health or developmental challenges. And we're going to document all the things it takes to get them better. And we're going to document this on film too, so that we can share this knowledge with you, so you can do it for your family too. In order to help more families, we need your help. There is no time to lose. Make a donation at documentinghope.com and feel great knowing that you were a part of the solution. We are documenting hope for our kids and for our future. Join us.
So thank you for listening to that video, and thank you for listening to me give my presentation. As you can see, the answers for our kids aren't necessarily in a pill. They're not in a special fancy device, or even one really amazingly skilled doctor or medical center. A lot of these things that are going to get our kids better are really about returning to the basics and the fundamentals of how human beings are supposed to be in the world and in nature and in families and in communities. And so we are doing the research to put some additional evidence behind what we already know. And also, it's going to be done independently, because there's no product to sell. There's no money to be made off this. We just want to restore children's health. So thanks for listening, and I'd be happy to take some questions now.
Beth, thank you. This is Ben from The Real Truth About Health. So many words come to mind: meaningful, alarming, frightening. But really, I thank you. What you're doing is heroic, and you're being a stand for all of us and for our kids. So really, really thank you. I know that you just showed a couple of websites there, website addresses, but just to make sure before we get into our Q&A, remind everybody again, where's the best place to get your books, or if people want to reach you, just tell us one more time, where should everybody go?
So both of my books, The Compromised Generation and Brain Under Attack, you can find on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles for Compromised Generation. And if people want more information about our work and what we're doing, you can go to epidemicanswers.org, or you can go to documentinghope.com, which is focused primarily on the research studies I told you about.
Excellent. Again, thank you very, very much for all of your work and for being here today. I know we already have some questions, and just so you know, and the rest of our audience knows, the way we go about that here for our live Q&A is we normally don't take questions directly from the chat box. However, we ask people to go ahead and raise their virtual hand. I think our tech team just put the instructions up on the screen. So ultimately, in your Zoom windows, what you'll want to do is click on your reactions tab down at the bottom. When you click on that reactions tab, there's a function that says raise hand. You click on that. We will see your hands come in. They're already starting to come in now. And we take your raised hands in the order in which they come in to us. Beth, I'll go ahead and unmute people with their raised hand and ask them for their questions. And so we set them up and you knock them down, and that's the way we work it here. So if you're ready, we'll go ahead.
Yep, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. And so the first person I see here is Laura S. Laura, I'm going to unmute you now. Or it looks like I'm going to ask you to unmute somehow. Hi, Laura. Laura, we're not hearing you. Are you there? Laura, I'm going to mute you and unmute you one more time. Let's see if we can do this. And if not, we'll just move on to the next one and have you come back. Laura, are you there? I see you're unmuted. So Laura, I'm not sure what's happening. I see that you're unmuted, but for some reason there's a sound difficulty. If you can work that out on your end and then get back online, and we'll get to you very shortly. I'm going to go ahead and move now to, let's see, Ainsley. Ainsley, I'm going to unmute you now. Hi, Ainsley.
Hi, morning, everyone. Doctor, thank you so much for seeing us this morning. I am a school teacher, 16 years in this service. And hearing what you said about what's happening to children, we teachers have identified this so many times in our classroom. But what we are faced with is the excessive paperwork of referrals. And then what happens, well, in my country, Trinidad, it just gets lost in the clutter. Then we have, it becomes very political. We're going to have voting. So all of those children are just shelved away. But being a teacher for the past 16 years, I knew these cases within my first month as a teacher. You know, this child is dyslexic, this child has ADHD, and we identify it as teachers, and it is annoying. In fact, that maybe I have to get on like Dr. Mills. It becomes so frustrating because when we have 30 children in front of us, and 2 or 3 children are not following the flock, and we refer it, and it goes to the social division, it just gets lost. I want to know, in your experience, doctor, how can teachers deal with this? How can we put more fire under these agencies to get cracking? Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think I'm so glad you spoke up, because I think that teachers are pretty much stuck holding a lot of the problems for our society that we're going through right now, because they're the ones that are managing a lot of these issues that children are struggling with every single day. And the support is not there and the funding's not there for the teachers. So the teachers are in the trenches and are just desperate to try and figure out how to overcome this. So what I would say is that I think it's really important to engage physicians and parents in this conversation, because I think many physicians and many parents don't know what's happening or what they can do, because many physicians weren't trained to look sort of from an integrative or functional perspective at their patients. A lot of times they're just managing symptoms with pharmaceuticals. I mean, that's just what they were trained in. So I think understanding the importance of nutrition for both physicians and parents is going to be massively important for communities to tackle. So I've seen some communities where, usually a parent brings experts into community meetings for the school. So, you pull the community together and you have a nutritionist come and talk about strategies for getting picky eaters to eat and improving nutrition in children, and, talking about screen time and all these kind of environmental things that, we just take for granted as normal. It's normal for kids to eat macaroni and cheese every day. It's normal for kids to eat tons of sugar. It's normal for kids to spend 8 and 10 hours in front of a screen. That feels normal, but it's not good for their health. So I think, if you're interested in becoming sort of more activist about it, it's about getting some people in your community. So finding a functional medicine doctor, an integrative physician who will come in and talk to a group of parents. Finding sort of, maybe there's a nutritionist in the area or somebody who focuses on environmental health, and bringing them in to talk to parents at a community meeting. I think that's the best thing we can do right now, and get the parents involved, because again, parents just don't know how they want to help their kids too. They want this all to go swimmingly, but and sometimes it's just about education and knowledge. So that's my best suggestion, is really just to pull some people together in the community and get them talking about these issues.
Thanks very much, Beth. And up next we have Ben. I'm going to unmute you, Ben. Hi, Ben. Ben, I'm hoping you can hear me. There's something wrong with your audio. I'm not sure what's happening there, but it sounded like slow motion. So if you can just, I'm going to lower your hand, but if you can come back in, we'll get back to you very shortly. Sorry about that, Ben. I'm not sure what happened, but do try again. And now I'm going to unmute somebody named Steve. And hi, Steve.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to be here. Thank you all. Have a question about the Walls protocol. Been following Terry Walls for over 8 years now, and she keeps saying that her studies are imminent and going to be published. And there's been one small study comparing by the NIH comparing her protocol to Dr. Roy Swank, who's got 50 years of follow-up. And it just seems like another one of these, paleo protocols that they get a lot of benefit from taking out some of the bad stuff, but we're still waiting for somebody to show us that there's a real additional benefit to adding animal products as opposed to going completely plant-based. Mm-hmm. A lot of the other things that this speaker quoted had studies and things to support them. Didn't hear anything about the Walls protocol. So I just wonder if there's any additional information about Walls, because we would love to see something positive about MS that has something to say about lesions and tests and studies, and not just about, a little bit improvement in fatigue, which is no better than any other protocol. Mm-hmm. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Steve. I think what you just highlighted is a really important distinction about bioindividuality. And I think one of the problems we have in the world of dietetics and nutrition is that people keep trying to prove or justify that there's one best way to eat for everybody. And I strongly believe in bioindividuality, and that there's different diets for different situations. There's, for instance, people who will go to the mat defending the fact that you need to eat sort of like Gershon or Hippocrates type approach for cancer, and they have amazing successes doing that. And I know somebody who would go to the same kind of level of intensity and trying to support the idea of keto for cancer, as an example. So there's such strong feelings about this. And I think there is research that's coming out. I don't know anything about what's prohibiting Dr. Walls from getting her publications. I don't know, the situation with her, barriers to publications right now. Although I will say that, a lot of medicine right now is driven by pharmaceuticals and, symptom suppressive products. So sometimes it's harder to get lifestyle publications published. But what I will say is that there are some people out there who are doing a really great job teaching about bioindividual approaches to nutrition. So one example would be, there's a nutritionist named Julie Matthews who has a wonderful website called Nourishing Hope. She's written a couple books. She focuses predominantly on children, but she looks at nutrition bioindividually. So, you can't say that like paleo is for everyone, or specific carbohydrate diet is for everyone, or keto is for everyone. Like, there is no one diet that's for every situation. So I really appreciate and respect that bioindividual approach. And the best way to sort of tackle that in terms of trying to figure out which diet is right for me is doing some testing. There's also other approaches, like, people who practice traditional Chinese medicine have completely different ways of looking at diet and how food can influence your health. So I think that's waiting for somebody to tell us what to do because they did research and this is the best way to eat is never going to satisfy us. I think the way to get satisfied, especially if we're doing on our own healing journey, is to really get in touch with your own body and your own needs and requirements as a bio individual. Again, Julie Matthews is probably, she has a institute where she's training people on how to do that. And she's one of the people that I know that's most skilled and expert in that area. And I really do encourage you to start thinking about that. there is a wonderful book written by a woman named Palmer Keepola called Reversing Autoimmune, and she reversed MS in herself. So Terry Walls isn't the only one out there teaching and helping people through MS. So I encourage you to check out Palmer Keepola's book and resources in her website.
Beth, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to go ahead now and bring in, let's see, Janet. Janet, I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Janet.
Hi, good morning. My question is, you know, the food sources that we're giving our kids, the dairy in schools. My children are grown men at this point, and 20 years ago when they were in school, it was macaroni and cheese, pizza, hot dogs, and burgers, and, you know, sweet snacks. And it really hasn't, I'm just shocked that it hasn't changed a whole lot. We're still giving kids chocolate milk, strawberry milk, and, you know, and foods that are not healthy, causing these diseases. What is being done on that front to educate, you know, the school food directors and the government funded programs that are, you know, providing these school lunches for schools in every district? It's not just in districts that are underprivileged and, you know, can't afford it. I'm lucky to be in a middle class area, and my kids were being you know, fed in parochial schools and public schools, and very poor options. And it's very frustrating that nothing has changed in all these years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Janet, I have to share an anecdote with you. When my kids were younger, in elementary school, I was appalled watching the food that was being offered in the public school system. So I went into my children's public school and sat down with the director of nutrition there, and literally went line by line through her, you know, her orders that she was putting in for the different types of food for the entire school system, and went through to try and troubleshoot and problem solve ways that we could improve the nutritional quality of the food, the nutrient density. I mean, literally was looking with her through her records and being like, okay, can we replace this, you know, processed food with black beans instead, you know, for more fiber? Like, and her hands were tied. She only had so much money. She only had so much support. You know, there were nutritional guidelines that came from the federal government, from state guidelines. I mean, these people's hands are tied. It's so hard. So the thing that I think is the answer is, just like I was saying moments ago to Ainsley's question about, you know, what do we do about this in the schools? It has to happen on a community level. And I'll give you a great example. There is a wonderful woman named Hillary Boynton who is in Southern California, and she has a program called School of Lunch. And she is training different nutrition professionals how to incorporate more nutrient dense food into the school lunch programs. For instance, there are some communities where parents literally volunteer and come in to man a salad bar because there isn't enough money to have staff man a salad bar, and there's federal requirements, et cetera. So there are communities where the parents come in and volunteer and support in order to get more nutritious food into the community. And Hillary Boynton in the School of Lunch is her program, trains people how to do these community-based efforts. So what I'm telling you is that it is like at the governmental level, at the policy level, it is just gridlock and it's hard. But if you can get a group of motivated parents together to try and problem solve this on the local level, I know that sounds like easier said than done, but I've seen people who have done it when the parents are motivated enough. Again, it all just comes back to community-based approaches to restoring our children's health.
Beth, thank you very, very much for that. We have Laura is back. Let's cross our fingers that I'm going to ask you to unmute, Laura, and see if that works. Oh, hang on. Okay, Laura, are you there? Oh no, we still have a problem with Laura's audio. Laura, I'm not sure what to tell you to do on your end, but I see that you're unmuted and we are just not hearing you. I don't know if there's a volume control on your own computer. Laura, are you there? I see you just muted yourself, and let's try to, I'm going to ask you to unmute one more time. Laura, I'm so sorry. We're still not getting you. Just not sure what to do there. Forgive us, Laura, if you can try back perhaps on our next lecture, please do. We'd love to hear from you. Beth, we have another minute or so, if that's okay. I normally don't go to the chat box, but I noticed somebody mentioned Annette M, that she was talking about how teachers in her district are not allowed to bring in any medical nutritional experts, nor can they make suggestions for parents to see such experts. We're told that these suggestions make the district liable. And she asked her principal about bringing in a nutritionist because she noticed the appalling diets that most kids are eating. It's sad because teachers are bearing the brunt of these behavioral problems in our classrooms, but because of politics and fear of lawsuits, they weren't allowed to be part of the solution. And again, we have about 2 minutes before our next lecture, but I just wonder, you've been commenting on this, but if you want to give us just a little more insight on that specific thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's really hard. And the only thing I can say, and I can't speak from any personal experience because I've never been successful at that and I've never done that. The only thing I can say is to try and keep running it up the flagpole, school board, superintendents. I will give you something encouraging that happened when there was a period of time about 8 years ago when I got pulled in to provide some advice to a local group of citizens in New Hampshire who were talking to the superintendent about putting nutrition curriculum into the schools. And they got very far along in the process, actually, believe it or not. They, and it's going to differ from state to state, district to district, obviously, but they pulled in the superintendent of the schools and he was all in. He loved the idea. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the only reason it didn't happen was because of funding. But I'm telling you, just keep running it up the flagpole. Talk to school board officials, talk to superintendents. I do think if the more parents you have involved, if you have an engaged group of parents and teachers and you go to the superintendent and you really put the pressure on them, you're going to see more progress. And I understand the policies and restrictions are really just crippling. But don't give up. I think that the only way we're going to see change is if citizens, parents, teachers, community members really pull together and just keep pushing it.
Thank you for that, and well said. And I would say all the more why we thank you for the work you're doing, and again, the stand that you're being for us and for our children. As we wrap up, I have to say, Beth, I am certain I'm not the only one that wants to thank you. So I'm going to ask my tech team to unmute our entire audience. What do you all want to say to Beth Lambert?
We love you.
Thank you.
This is wonderful.